I welcome the opportunity to speak on Budget 2026 this evening. In this contribution, I'd like to mainly focus on the macro issues and some of the key measures announced. While in my slot tomorrow, I hope to go more into individual measures in terms of what's welcome, what's unwelcome, and what is a missed opportunity. And in fact, there are plenty of missed opportunities, both day-to-day and strategic. First, and I don't think too many people have, we need to look at the context. This budget has echoes of 2007. In the budget before the election of that year, all political parties, including the one I was then a member of, albeit to a lesser extent, called for increased spending across the board. People ignored the signs where we were depending on the service sector to keep the party going. The Celtic Tiger appeared as if it would never end, and while some like Anne Pettifor and Nouriel Roubini sounded warnings internationally, not to mention our own Jim Power and David McWilliams, here in Ireland, few politicians, if any, thought for a second that a Wile E. Coyote moment was coming, and in a global and in particular Irish finance situation, things would fall off a cliff. If they did, nobody was letting on. Fianna Fáil was re-elected for a third successive term on the back of a massive giveaway budget. But then, after just a few months in office, the mood music changed. The budget of October 2007 was a more muted affair, still splashing the cash, but there was a knowledge that the revenues were beginning to dry up. The global economic crash and banking crisis that followed hit many countries worldwide. But if Fianna Fáil's economic policies post-2000 made the boom boomier, they also made the crash an absolute wreck. We know how the rest turned out. Tough, unpopular decisions had to be made to clean up the mess, and policies were put in place to ensure that such a disaster could never happen again. Or could it? One of the measures put in place was the establishment of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, the aim of which was to provide independent oversight and not let politicians get carried away. It's always focused on financial prudence, but for some years, especially relevant post-COVID, the Fiscal Advisory Council, the so-called watchdog, has been urging extra special caution, warning that the corporate tax receipts windfall could dry up at any time and should not be factored into economic deliberations. Before this budget, for example, it stated, given that the economy is performing well, this is not a time for a large budget package. Budgetary policies are already providing significant support. After excluding excess corporation tax receipts, the government is spending more than it collects in underlying revenue. Spending more than it collects in underlying revenue. Just think about that. After excluding these excess corporation tax receipts, the government is not heeding the call, or this year it's heeded the call, but in previous years it didn't heed the call. So it did set a relatively small proportion aside for areas that are historically underfunded. Minister O'Donoghue said at the start of his contribution that uncertainty is the defining feature of the global economy this year, and indeed it is, but uncertainty was predicted before Trump's tariffs, and any truly fiscally responsible government would have reflected this in decisions made during last year's giveaway budget. But if a little dampening down was done last year in reducing the sweeteners, there might have been a little bit more in the coffers this year. And its reduction in largesse would not have been noticed to the same extent. So this budget does talk the talk on being financially responsible, but shows no signs of cutting wastage and still finds room for money to be thrown out, albeit in the wrong sectors. On the day-to-day side of things, I think this budget is a missed opportunity to help carers, people with disabilities, other vulnerable people, and early years education in particular. Or indeed a small bit more to help those dealing with the increased cost of living. The measures that have been announced in these areas are so incremental as to have no meaningful effect. Instead, we've helped wealthy developers and investors with an ill-thought-out and premature reduction in VAT for apartment building, a move that ignores the fundamental issues behind the housing crisis, which is one primarily of supply, from infrastructure to planning to tendering to training enough construction workers. And it's also not helped by overseas investment policy that places jobs for non-essential workers, localisation workers, for example, in highest demand housing areas. We've also seen a generalised reduction in VAT for the hospitality sector, so while the small cafe benefits, so too does the larger entity making massive profits. So Ronald McDonald gets the tax breaks, while the McDonald family members living in Clondalkin, Lucan, Palmerstown, etc. struggle to keep up with costs. What would have been more sensible was the extension of the increasing cost of business grant or the Power Up grant, which could have been more targeted for small business in this sector. On the macro level, I do welcome the medium-term fiscal and structural plan, which reflects the Advisory Council's call for more medium-term planning. It's not quite multi-annual funding, but it is a start. Because revenues have been so unprecedented in recent years, we've been putting away some money, 2 billion in 2022, 4 billion in 23, which the Fiscal Advisory Council said was relatively small in comparison to the overall estimated excess corporation tax receipts. Last year, as the Minister outlined, the National Reserve Fund was dissolved, but transferred approximately 8.4 billion to the new Future Ireland Fund and Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. Now, further funds have been added this year, which on one hand I welcome for the prudence, but given what's facing us down the line, I do believe we're missing out on opportunities that will cost us all massively in the long run. And if as Minister O'Donoghue stated, if we're going to have 40 billion built up in long-term funds by the end of the government term, we're actually destroying our future. Because what we're missing is strategic infrastructural planning, where we use that windfall receipt and the Apple money to put us in a more stable footing in the years ahead. Areas such as front-loading the water services infrastructure, improving the grid and energy generation potential, making us a net exporter rather than the 6 billion we're spending in imports. Areas such as gearing up for a massive increase in homegrown prefabricated and modular housing and apprenticeships to go alongside it. I'll elaborate on some of these issues more tomorrow, as well as on some of the specifics of the budget, but on a macro level, we're actually missing an opportunity where we could have started the long-term planning in this budget.
Thank you, Deputy.